I still tremble when I tell this story, not from fear but from the weight of glory that descended that night. What I witnessed in Sudan wasn't just a miracle, it was God tearing open the fabric between heaven and earth. Brothers and sisters, what I'm about to share isn't just a testimony. It's a prophecy of what's coming to the persecuted church worldwide. My name is Thomas Abram. I'm 42 years old, born and raised in Manchester, England. For 15 years, I've worked with various missionary organizations documenting Christian persecution around the world. I wasn't always a believer. In fact, until my late 20s, I was a determined atheist, a journalist who prided himself on rational thinking and hard evidence. Faith was something I studied from the outside, like an anthropologist observing tribal customs. I reported on religious conflicts in dozens of countries, but always with detached professionalism. That changed during an assignment in Myanmar. I won't share that full story now, but something happened in a small village church that left me unable to deny God's reality any longer. Since then, I've dedicated my life to telling the stories of the persecuted church, not just as news items, but as testimonies to God's faithfulness in the darkest places. It was 3:17 a.m. when my phone rang. I remember the time precisely because I stared at it bleary-eyed, wondering who would call at such an hour. The number was international, with a code I didn't recognize. "Hello," I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "Thomas." The voice was urgent, barely above a whisper. "It's Elias." Elias Mukhtar was my contact in East Africa, a converted Muslim who now coordinated an underground network of churches across several countries. We'd worked together for years, but I hadn't heard from him in months. "Brother, the Lord has told me to call you." His voice trembled slightly. "There is something you must witness in Sudan, a gathering of believers in Khartoum. The Spirit says you must come immediately." I sat up in bed, fully awake now. "Elias, what's happening?" "Sudan is extremely dangerous right now. 3 nights ago, I had a vision," he continued, ignoring my concerns. "I saw you standing in a church in Khartoum. Light was pouring from the ceiling, and I heard the Lord say, 'Let Thomas witness my glory. You must come, brother.' In 4 days, there will be a secret gathering of over 300 believers from across the country. Many are risking their lives to attend." Something in his voice silenced my objections. I'd learned to recognize when God was orchestrating events. I felt a familiar weight in my spirit, that gentle but unmistakable pressure that always preceded God's most profound movements in my life. "I'll be there," I said simply. The next 48 hours were a blur of rushed preparations. Sudan was in the middle of political upheaval. Christians there faced persecution from both government forces and extremist groups. Getting in wouldn't be easy, especially with camera equipment. My organization advised strongly against the trip. My editor called it suicidal. My wife Rachel, who has always supported my work, looked at me with concern as I packed. "You've never been this quiet before a trip," she said, folding a shirt and placing it in my bag. "What aren't you telling me?" I stopped and took her hands. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I know I have to be there. Elias wouldn't have called if it wasn't important." She nodded slowly. "I've been praying since you told me, and I keep seeing the same image, a room filled with light." She squeezed my hands. Go, but promise me you'll be careful." That promise would be tested beyond anything I could have imagined. The flight to Khartoum was uneventful, but I felt the spiritual atmosphere change the moment I stepped off the plane. There's a heaviness that hangs over places where spiritual warfare is intense. I felt it in North Korea, in parts of India, in certain regions of the Middle East. But this was different. Along with the oppression was an electric sense of anticipation, as if the very air was holding its breath. Elias met me at a small cafe 3 blocks from the airport. He'd aged since I'd last seen him. New lines etched around his eyes, his beard now streaked with grey, but his eyes still burned with the same intensity. "Thank you for coming," he said, embracing me. "We don't have much time." As we drove through Khartoum's crowded streets, he explained the situation. The gathering would take place in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Believers had been secretly traveling for days, some walking over 100 miles, others hiding in cargo trucks. Many had sold possessions to make the journey. "But why?" I asked. "Why risk so much for a meeting?" Elias glanced at me. 3 months ago, a 12-year-old girl named Grace from a village near the border with South Sudan began having visions. She saw the Lord gathering his people in Khartoum. She saw healing and revival. She saw a great light that would change the heart of the nation. I nodded, familiar with such stories. Throughout history, God has often spoken through the young and the unlikely. At first, only her village believed, Elias continued. But then the miracles started. The blind seeing, the lame walking, and more children, dozens of them across different regions who had never met or spoken, began having the same vision. They all pointed to the same date, the same city. Tonight, I said quietly. Tonight, he confirmed. We arrived at a small, nondescript hotel where I would wait until nightfall. The room was sparse. A bed, a chair, a small table with a Bible placed conspicuously on top. I spent the hours praying, preparing my equipment, and reading Psalms. Outside my window, the city pulsed with life, unaware of what was building in its midst. As the sun set, casting long shadows across my room, I received a text with an address. It was time. Elias picked me up in a different car, older, less noticeable. We drove in silence through increasingly narrow streets, finally turning down an unpaved road lined with abandoned buildings. The security situation was tense. Just 2 weeks earlier, a house church had been raided in another part of the city. 7 believers had been arrested. Their fate was still unknown. We parked several blocks from our destination and continued on foot, taking a circuitous route through alleys and side streets. Finally, Elias stopped before a rusted metal door set in a crumbling concrete wall. "We're here," he whispered. He knocked. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. The door opened just enough for us to slip inside. A young man with watchful eyes closed it behind us, securing multiple locks. We were in a small anteroom with concrete walls. I could hear the faint sound of singing coming from somewhere deeper in the building. "They're checking everyone who enters," Elias explained as we were directed to wait. "There have been threats." After a few minutes, we were led through a series of corridors, the singing growing louder with each step. Finally, we emerged into a vast, open space, what had once been a factory floor of some kind, now transformed into a sanctuary. I stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed by what I saw. Hundreds of people, far more than the 300 Elias had mentioned, filled the space. They sat on the floor, stood against walls, crowded together in whatever space they could find. Old and young, men and women, people from different tribes and backgrounds, who would normally be separated by ethnic and political divisions. Here they were, united in worship. The room was lit by battery-powered lanterns placed strategically around the edges. In the center was a simple wooden cross. No stage, no sound system, no screens, nothing that would mark this as a church service in the Western world. Yet the presence of God was so thick, I found myself struggling to breathe. A woman near the front was leading worship, her voice clear and unwavering as she sang in Arabic. I didn't understand the words, but I recognized the melody. "Great is thy faithfulness," adapted to local musical styles. The crowd swayed together, hands raised, faces shining with tears and joy. Elias guided me to a spot near one wall where I could set up my small camera unobtrusively. As I did, I noticed a young girl sitting quietly in the front row. Unlike the others who were lost in worship, she sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on something none of us could see. "That's Grace," Elias whispered, following my gaze, "the one who had the visions." She couldn't have been more than 12, small for her age, wearing a simple blue dress. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her, yet I couldn't look away. Something about her stillness, her focus, spoke of a maturity and spiritual authority that transcended her years. The worship continued for over an hour. No one seemed tired or distracted. There was an urgency to their prayers, a desperation in their worship that I've only seen in places where faith costs everything. These believers weren't singing about theoretical suffering or hypothetical persecution. They were living it daily. Eventually, an older man stepped forward. Elias leaned close. "Pastor Daniel, he's been imprisoned 3 times for his faith. The last time, they thought they had killed him. He was in a coma for 6 days, then woke up preaching." Pastor Daniel spoke softly, but with authority. He didn't need to shout. The room fell immediately silent when he began. He spoke in Arabic, with another man translating into English for the few foreigners present. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "God has gathered us here for a purpose. For months, the Spirit has been speaking through our children." He gestured toward Grace and several other young people scattered throughout the congregation. "They have seen a great light coming, a light that will reveal God's glory, not just to us, but to those who persecute us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Pastor Daniel continued, "Many of you traveled at great risk to be here. Some of you were followed, some of you were threatened, but the Lord says, 'Do not fear, for I am with you.'" As he spoke, I noticed movement near the back of the room. Several of the men who had been watching the door were now engaged in an intense whispered conversation. One of them slipped out through a side entrance. Something was happening. Pastor Daniel seemed to sense it too. His voice never wavered, but his next words sent a chill through me. "The Lord told us there would be opposition. The enemy will not surrender this nation without a fight, but greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world." Elias gripped my arm. "Keep filming," he whispered. "No matter what happens." The atmosphere in the room shifted. The worship had been joyful, expectant. Now there was a tension, a coiling of spiritual energy. People began to pray more fervently, some dropping to their knees, others standing with arms outstretched. Then Grace stood up. She didn't say anything at first. She simply walked to the center of the room and stood before the wooden cross. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and carried to every corner of the warehouse. "They are coming," she said in Arabic, which someone quickly translated for me. "Men with hatred in their hearts, men with weapons. But do not fear. Tonight they will see the glory of the Lord." As if on cue, there was a commotion at the main entrance. The metal door burst open with a crash that echoed through the cavernous space. Armed men poured in, at least 15 of them, carrying rifles and machetes. They wore civilian clothes but moved with military precision. Some wore scarves over their faces. "Government militia," Elias breathed beside me. Screams erupted from the congregation. Parents reached for children. Friends pulled each other close. But remarkably, no one ran. There was nowhere to go. The building had limited exits, all of which were now blocked. The leader of the armed group, a tall man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, stepped forward. "This gathering is illegal," he shouted in Arabic, his voice hard with contempt. "You have been warned before about practicing your foreign religion." Pastor Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the armed men and his congregation. "We are simply praying," he said calmly. "We mean no harm to anyone." The leader laughed. "Praying to a dead god won't help you now." He gestured to his men, who began to spread out, surrounding the congregation. I kept filming, though my hands were shaking. I had documented persecution before, but had never been caught in the middle of a raid. What happened next defies rational explanation. Grace, who had remained motionless at the center of the room, suddenly raised her face toward the ceiling. "Now, Lord," she said simply, "show them your glory." At first, nothing seemed to happen. The armed men continued to advance. The leader raised his rifle, pointing it at Pastor Daniel's chest. I heard the distinctive click as he disengaged the safety. Then I felt it, a vibration, like the deepest bass note you've ever heard, but felt rather than heard. The concrete floor beneath us trembled. The lanterns flickered, and from directly above Grace a pinpoint of light appeared. It wasn't like a spotlight or a beam from outside. This light seemed to originate from nothing, a tear in reality itself. It started small, no larger than a coin, but grew rapidly, expanding outward in pulsing waves of brilliant white-gold radiance. Within seconds, it was the size of a dinner plate, then a car tire, then wider still, casting its glow over Grace and the wooden cross. The armed men faltered, their expressions shifting from anger to confusion to the beginnings of fear. The leader shouted something, urging his men forward, but they seemed reluctant to approach the growing light. And then the light spoke. I don't mean that there was a voice from the light, though that would have been miracle enough. I mean that the light itself formed words, not in English or Arabic or any earthly language, but in what I can only describe as pure meaning that bypassed the ears and went straight to the heart. Everyone in that warehouse, regardless of their native tongue, understood perfectly. I am. Just those two words, but they contained the weight of eternity. They resonated with such authority that several of the armed men dropped their weapons. Others fell to their knees. The leader remained standing, but his rifle now hung limply at his side, forgotten. The light continued to expand, now filling almost half the warehouse ceiling. It wasn't harsh or blinding, though it was brighter than the midday sun. Instead, it was somehow gentle despite its intensity, like being immersed in liquid gold that didn't burn. And then the light began to descend. It came down first over Grace, who remained perfectly still, her expression one of absolute peace. When the light touched her, she didn't disappear within it as I expected. Instead, she seemed to become more visible, more real somehow, as if everything we'd been seeing before was just a shadow of her true self. The light continued to spread, flowing like water over the congregation. As it touched each person, the same transformation occurred. Colors became more vivid, features more defined, expressions more radiant. It was as if the light was revealing everyone's true nature, burning away pretense and fear and doubt. When it reached us, Elias gasped beside me. I felt it too, a warmth that penetrated to my core, a love so intense it was almost painful, a knowledge so complete that for a moment I understood everything. The meaning of suffering, the purpose of persecution, the ultimate triumph of God's plan. My camera continued to record, though I have no memory of holding it. The armed men were the last to be enveloped by the light. I watched as it reached the leader with the scarred face. Unlike the believers who had welcomed the light, he tried to back away, raising his arm as if to shield himself. But there was nowhere to go. When the light touched him, he screamed, not in pain, but as if something long buried was tearing its way out of him. He fell to his knees, the scar on his face now gleaming as if traced with fire. "I know you," he sobbed in Arabic. "I've always known you." One by one, the other armed men had similar reactions. Some wept silently. Others cried out in what sounded like anguish but was actually release. 3 of them began speaking in tongues, perfect, fluent Aramaic, according to a scholar who was present. For what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, the light continued to pulse and flow throughout the warehouse. No one spoke, no one moved. We were all held in a moment outside of time. Then, as gradually as it had appeared, the light began to recede. It didn't diminish in brightness, but rather seemed to be absorbed into each person present, like water into thirsty ground. The last traces of it lingered over the wooden cross before disappearing entirely. In the relative dimness of the lantern-lit warehouse there was absolute silence. Then the leader of the armed group, the man who had come to arrest, perhaps kill, these Christians, laid his rifle on the ground and walked slowly toward Pastor Daniel. For a terrible moment, I thought he might attack the pastor with his bare hands. Instead, he knelt before him. "Forgive me," he said, his voice breaking. "I have persecuted what I did not understand." Pastor Daniel helped the man to his feet and embraced him. "You are forgiven, brother, and welcomed." One by one, the other armed men followed suit, laying down their weapons and approaching the Christians they had come to harm. What followed was unlike anything I've ever witnessed. Former persecutors embracing the persecuted, lifelong enemies weeping together, healing and reconciliation happening before my eyes. The man with the scarred face, whose name we learned was Malik, asked to speak. His men gathered close around him, along with the congregation who now regarded them not with fear, but with the warmth of newfound family. "All my life," Malik said, "I have hated Christians. I was taught that you were enemies of our culture, our traditions, our faith. I have done," he faltered, "terrible things in the name of that hatred." He touched the scar on his face. "This was given to me by a Christian, or so I was told, a missionary who fought back when we attacked his church. For 15 years I have worn it as a reminder of why I fight." He laughed bitterly. "But in the light I remembered the truth. This was given to me by my commander when I refused to kill a Christian child. I was 16 years old." Murmurs of sympathy spread through the crowd. Malik continued, "The light showed me everything I have buried, and it showed me who you really are, not enemies, but brothers and sisters I never knew I had." He turned to his men. "What we saw tonight was the truth. We can no longer fight against it." One of Malik's younger soldiers stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "They will kill us if we don't return," he said. "They will send others." Pastor Daniel placed his hands on both men's shoulders. "Then stay with us, all of you. What God has started here tonight, he will complete." What happened over the next few days defied all human expectation. Malik and his men did stay, hidden in safe houses throughout Khartoum. Word of what had happened spread rapidly through the underground church. By the end of the week, over 30 other former persecutors had sought out churches, asking for forgiveness and protection. But the most remarkable transformation was in Grace. The quiet, unassuming girl who had stood at the center of God's revelation now moved with newfound purpose. She began to prophesy with astonishing accuracy, not just spiritual insights, but specific events in the political sphere. "There will be a change in government within 30 days, she announced one evening as several of us gathered in a secret location. "A man of peace will rise to temporary power. He will open a window, just for a season, when the church can worship openly. You must be ready." Exactly 27 days later, a bloodless coup removed the hardline faction that had been orchestrating much of the persecution. The new leader, while not a Christian himself, had a Christian mother and declared a 3-month period of religious reflection, during which all faith groups were permitted to worship without interference. The underground church seized the opportunity. Public baptisms were held in the Nile. Evangelistic meetings drew thousands, and at the center of it all was the testimony of Malik and his men, former persecutors now boldly proclaiming the Christ they had once hated. On the final Sunday of the religious reflection period, something unprecedented occurred. The state television network, which had previously broadcast only approved religious content, aired a 30-minute segment on the changing religious landscape of Sudan. Included was a brief interview with Malik, his scarred face now a symbol not of hatred, but of transformation. "I have seen the light of truth," he said simply, looking directly into the camera, "and it has set me free." The government crackdown that many expected at the end of the 3 months never fully materialized. Yes, there were still restrictions. Yes, Christians still faced discrimination and occasional violence, but something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of the nation. When I finally returned home after 6 weeks in Sudan, I brought with me over 40 hours of footage, including the miraculous events in the warehouse. Some of it was later broadcast, carefully edited to protect identities. Some remains unreleased, too sacred or too dangerous to share widely. My wife met me at the airport, searching my face as I emerged from the arrival gate. "You're different," she said, touching my cheek. "Something's changed." That night, as we sat in our comfortable living room thousands of miles from Khartoum, I showed her the unedited footage from the warehouse. We watched together as the light appeared, expanded and transformed everyone it touched. When it was over, she sat in silence for a long time. "All my life," she finally said, "I've believed in God's power, but I've never seen it like this." I took her hands, just as I had before leaving. That's why I had to go. That's why I have to tell this story. What happened in Sudan isn't just for Sudan. It's a foretaste of what God wants to do everywhere. In the years since that night, I've witnessed similar outpourings in other persecuted regions, different in their specifics, but identical in their essence. Divine light breaking into impossible situations, former enemies reconciled. The church growing strongest precisely where opposition is fiercest. And always, it begins with the same elements that were present in that warehouse in Khartoum: desperate prayer, expectant worship, and the simple faith of those who have nothing to rely on but God. I believe we're entering an era of divine visitation, unlike anything the church has seen in centuries. The light that appeared in Sudan is available wherever God's people gather in authentic hunger for His presence. It may not always be visible to physical eyes, but it is no less real, no less transformative. To you who are reading this, whether you're serving God in freedom or in chains, whether you're worshiping openly or in secret, I want to say this: the light is coming. Perhaps it's already here, waiting only for you to recognize it. Are you ready to be transformed? Are you ready to see your enemies transformed? Are you ready for God to use you as He used a 12-year-old girl named Grace in a warehouse in Khartoum? The question isn't whether God will show up. The light is already breaking through. The question is, will you stand in its path? I've seen what happens when we do, and brothers and sisters, it changes everything.